Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we are jumping back into a couple of beers from Kona Brewing Company. This is my second Kona Brewing review. This time it's two completely different beer styles. So we'll have quite a difference in running range from lighter to darker. We're going to be starting today with Kona's Big Wave. This is a golden ale, 4.4%. Kona Brewing is headquartered based out of Kona, Hawaii. Though they have different brewing operations. This specifically was brewed in their Fort Collins, Colorado location. Beer number two is a Pipeline. This is a porter that they have brewed with Kona coffee. 5.3% ABV on this one. And this one, it didn't specifically state where it was brewed, but it could have been anywhere. I mean, they have Fort Collins, Kona, Portland, Oregon, Portsmouth, New Hampshire. But nonetheless, two completely different beer styles, and I'm really excited to jump in and see what these are about. So we're going to do just that, starting with the Big Wave Golden Ale at 4.4% ABV. Okay, starting with our first beer, this is the Big Wave. It's their Golden Ale, 4.4% ABV. Let's see. Bottle art has a bunch of people in what looks to be a large canoe, though catamaran style with the little outboard kind of buoy underneath a very big wave indeed. So, you know, kind of a Hawaiian themed label. Let's get this poured right in. Oh, that's a beautiful looking golden ale. Yeah, that's lovely. Lovely, lovely beer. Yep, that is a textbook golden ale. It is a beautiful deep gold color. It is crystal clear, very, very effervescent. Kind of a mix of small and medium carbonation coming through. So it actually formed a reasonably creamy head, though I don't know how long it's going to hold. Indeed, I can see it already breaking apart. So let's give this a sniff. Oh, it smells very nice. It smells kind of like a classic golden ale. Actually, it kind of reminds me of a couple different styles as well. Maybe a bit like a Pilsner and a bit like Helles. I'd even go so far as to throw a third in there, a bit like a Keller beer. It's kind of an amalgam in aroma. It's got elements of it that remind me of all of those beer styles. And they're not all drastically different, but yeah, it smells great. I'm going to jump right in. Oh, though actually before I do, very neat, suspended in mid-beer, carbonation bead, super fine champagne-like, not coming from the bottom. It's just like it's coming out of the middle of the beer. It looks really, really neat. Nonetheless, let's dive in. Okay. This is not the biggest intensity of flavor I've ever tasted in a beer. I would almost go so far as to say not weak, but it's on the mild, very mild end of the spectrum in terms of flavor. Does this taste to me like a classic golden ale? It's got the spirit. It just doesn't have enough presence flavor-wise. I'm kind of starting to see a common theme with this brewery is that their beers maybe are brewed to appeal to the masses and they're not overboard at all in any way. Thus far, that session IPA, the tropical IPA that was orange guava and a passion fruit was probably the most impressive of the bunch because as a session, it really had a lot of aroma and flavor presence. This is leaving me wanting for more. I'm going to jump back in for body mouthfeel finish just to pinpoint where this happens. Body is medium light, 4.4% ABV. I can't say I'm surprised there. Mouthfeel, it's an interesting mix. It's got some dry qualities to it, but it's also relatively creamy. Not cream ale or super creamy, thick stout. Not quite to that level, but it's got a relatively creamy texture to it in the palate. but it also has a bit of a dry edge to it. So the finish doesn't last particularly long. And I've mentioned this in prior reviews. When you have a drier beer, typically speaking, it's going to reduce the length of the finish just due to the nature of the beast. It keeps it from having much staying power and viscosity to stick around the palate when it's got more of a brute-like finish. And don't get me wrong, this is not a brute dry finish, but it's got elements of a drier finish to it than I would certainly expect in a golden ale. Typically, those are wetter. I don't want to say rounder, but there's no hint of a dryness to them. So they tend to have a bit more staying power. Really, when you first get it in your mouth, there's a malty sweetness, and then that sweetness opens up to a classic grain-like quality. But everything about this is very, very mild. It's very subdued. The aroma is a little subdued. It looks the part. The aroma is a little subdued. The flavor is very subdued for the style. It's well balanced though. The way that it comes through is well balanced. The only thing that really I'm detecting in here at all is any real sense of hop presence. It's not in the aroma. And it's not really in the flavor. And it's not a heavily hopped beer style for starters, but normally you can at least detect, oh, that's got that hop or that's got that type of hop, and at least recognize that it's in the beer. This is an interesting beer. Yeah, I'm going to have to take my time and sip on this while I come up with my scores and really think on this one. I'm not sure exactly what to make of it. It's not bad. It's just, it lacks presence. It lacks presence just as its own beer, and it lacks presence certainly for the style. But I'll take my time. I'll be really critical and really think on it. And when we come back, we will get to Pipeline. That's their porter brewed with Kona coffee, and that clocks in at 5.3% ABV. Okay, moving on to our second beer. This is the Pipeline Porter. It's brewed with Kona coffee in it as well. So it is a coffee porter. 5.3% ABV on this one. Let's check this label art. This one's just got a surfer standing on the beach staring at a wave. So, you know, feeling very Hawaiian. Let's get this poured right into the glass. Okay. Nice, rich, deep brown, as I expect from a porter. Doesn't look super thick, as I expect from a porter. That's 5.3. This is kind of a middle of the road for a porter. Formed a reasonably decent head here. Holding it up to the light, this is actually quite dark, especially for 5.3% ABV on a porter. That's, cut that out. That's quite light. That's quite dark. Head actually formed rather creamy. I can see the carbonation working its way up, though. It looks like it's going to hold, so I ought to maintain a decent head pad floating on here. Let's give this a sniff. It smells very malty. I don't smell any of the coffee at all. Make sure I'm not losing my mind. Porter made with Hawaiian Kona coffee. Okay, no, it is indeed a coffee porter. I can't really pick any of it up on the nose. I really smell the malts. Oh, gosh, you really got to breathe in deep. It's very, very mild. It smells, at least. It's just on the back end. Dominant is the malt, and it smells rather sweet, with a bit of a roasty edge to it, but I'm getting sweetness in the aroma. So had to settle down. I don't want to totally lose it. Let's get a sip. That's a nice porter. That's a nice porter. Okay. So far of the 4 that I've reviewed, this for me is, along with that lower ABV, what I'm calling a session IPA, they do not. I am 4.5%, that session. That was the Orange Guava Passion Fruit IPA. Along with that one, these are the 2 that I would, go for if I were to drink something from Kona again, if I didn't want to try something new that they had. This beer has a lot more going for it. It's just got more depth. It's got more presence. It's got more flavor. The aroma, I wasn't really sure what I was going to get when I got in the glass, and it took a minute, but once it settles around the palate, the flavors really start to intensify and open up, and it's a proper porter. This is a really well done porter for 5.3%. It's actually it's got some bones to it. I'm going to jump in for body mouthfeel and explore how this finish develops. Body is medium light. It's not as heavy as I would think at 5.3. Mouth feels very creamy. It starts with a slight sweetness, and then it starts to develop that classic porter flavor that they get from their malt bill. And once that opens up, that's when the background roastiness of the malts really starts to come through, and then the coffee starts to work its way up, and then it opens up, and the coffee pairs with that roasty, deep roast edge to the malt bill. And that's when this beer really starts to come into its own. The coffee is not overboard. It's very balanced. It really just pairs extremely well. The way that they did this and balanced the ingredients pairs very, very well with the malt bill to where they kind of accentuate one another. The malts by themselves or the coffee by itself would probably be fine, but in the ratio that they did and worked them together, for me personally, it could still be a bit more intense, but this is not a weak beer. This is a proper porter. The coffee, I don't think that their intention was to brew a coffee porter. It's a porter that has some coffee in it, but I don't think that, perhaps I'm crazy, I'm speculating here, but it doesn't have enough coffee forward presence that I would say, oh yeah, I brewed a coffee porter. This is really a porter that just so happens to have some Kona coffee in it. And really what it does is brings just a little extra dimension to the beer and just makes a beautiful, beautiful blending with that roasty edge of the malts. And it really comes through quite nicely as the flavor continues to develop and intensify. And then it's just beautifully harmonious how the malt bill works with the coffee they added. Slight sweet, porter malt. The roasty malts come through, then the coffee picks in. And then the 2 combine, and that's right at the apex of the intensity of flavor. And it's not ridiculously intense. It's normal for a porter, really. And then it just kind of tapers downward from there. And what you're left with at the end of the finish is that lingering roasty malt edge mixed with that coffee. And it's beautifully balanced. You can taste them both independently as it's developing and through the finish. So you don't get one or the other. You get them both rather in a balanced harmony. It's nice. This is a nice porter. I'm much more pleased with this beer than 50% of the others that I've tried thus far. This is a good beer. I'm going to take my time. I'm going to sip on this, come up with my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both of these beers, we're going to go through and get them ranked, starting with the Big Wave. This is their Golden Ale, 4.4% ABV on this one. Starting with the aroma. The aroma was just okay. It wasn't super weak. It wasn't very pungent. It was just kind of middle of the road. It gets a 5 out of 10. Moving on to the taste. This was, I don't want to say it was watered down, but it was one of the less flavor forward golden ales I've ever had. They tend to, even though they're light, they tend to have a pretty pronounced malt backbone to them. And you could taste that the structure was there. It was just down on volume. And 4.4% ABV, that's kind of on the low end for a golden ale, but really, it didn't really bring that much to the table. I gave it the low end of average. I gave it a 4. Moving on to the body. The body, even for a low ABV golden ale, 4.4 is quite low. The body was ridiculously light. It's not a heavy beer style in general, unless you're talking about Belgian strong golden ales. Certainly there are American interpretations of that as well, but a standard blonde ale is a lighter beer, but this was ridiculously light to the point that you couldn't even tell you had beer in your mouth. It was really about the same weight as water. I gave a high end of average, just bearing in mind the ABV. I gave it a 6. For the mouthfeel was nice on this beer. It was certainly above average for a golden ale, and particularly considering its ABV. Golden ales aren't a super viscous style, but once they get a little more substance, the ABV goes up, the fermentable volume goes up, and it gets more breadth to the body that tends to impart more character traits to the mouthfeel. As it were, this one was surprisingly good for a low ABV. I gave it a 7 out of 10. Finish on this one. This beer did not have a very long finish at all. I would not say it was brief, but it certainly wasn't upper end of length of finish for golden ale. I gave it right middle of the road, just smack average. It gets a 5. Head and retention on this. This actually did form a pretty good head, and it did retain pretty well. Certainly above average, not as well as some upper echelon beers, but it did do well. And when I was looking at it in the glass and I was commenting on the really neat looking, super tiny, super fine champagne-like bubbles that were just kind of floating out of the middle, that was kind of the story of this beer. It had such fine carbonation that it imparted that really nice mouthfeel, but it didn't have enough activity to really give the head a greater chance to bloom up and to retain as much as, say, if I had gotten it poured on a tap at a bar. I'm sure it would have been wonderful, but poured at home, that's how it came out. I gave it above average. It gets a 7. Appearance-wise, this was a textbook golden ale. It was absolutely beautiful in the glass. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. For the balance on this. The balance on this, it's hard for me to say. Beer, when you're drinking it, as a rule, you're going to taste all of the ingredients that went in to make it, yeast notwithstanding. But hops are not only a preservative, they're obviously a flavoring agent, and it's not the star of the show in this beer style, but I certainly want to be able to detect the hops both in the aroma, and I want to detect them somewhere in the flavor profile, even if it's very, very minimal background. This was just, it tasted a pure malt. I couldn't detect any hint of the hop at all. So for me, greater volume, obviously that's going to boost our ABV up. I don't know if making a super low ABV golden ale was their intention, but it would have helped across multiple categories that are also affected. And certainly balance of aroma and flavor. I just gave it average again. I gave it a 5. Feeling in the intangible, I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. I thought it was average, and I've had many golden ales that I would consider to be far superior to this one. If you're not a fan of very strong beers, again, I'm seeing a trend with Kona Brewing. I kind of think maybe that's their shtick. They're not pushing the envelope. They're just making honest beer that isn't quite as intense. So perhaps the idea is have it to appeal to a broader array of individuals, maybe convert big box drinkers into craft slowly with less oppressive and intense beers. But for me, I give it a 4. Finally, as an example of the style, yet again, I gave it low end of average. I gave it a 4. It had a lot going for it. Certainly, there were many character traits that are standard golden ale, but it was too tame. There wasn't enough substance to the beer to really let me sink my teeth into it. And it's a shame because the base malts that they used in here, I could tell was a very solid golden ale malt backbone. It tasted Exactly right. It just didn't have the volume or the presence, and that affected the body, it affected the aroma, it affected the mouthfeel, it affected the finish. It really affected categories almost across the board. So for me, it does get a 4. That brings the total score to the Big Wave Golden Ale to a 57 out of 100. So squarely in the average range of offerings. Moving on to Pipeline, this is their porter that was brewed with Kona coffee. This one's 5.3% ABV, so hovering in the middle of average porter range. The aroma on this one had a nice aroma. I could clearly pick up the malts. The coffee was barely detectable in the aroma. And for me, if you're gonna make, while they're not calling it a coffee porter, the fact that they mentioned that they brewed it with Kona coffee, I do expect more presence. I appreciated I could smell the classic porter malt backbone and the nice roasty malts plus that classic porter sweetness on the nose, but I would have liked the coffee to come through a little stronger on the aroma. I gave it high end of average, I gave it a 6. The taste on this was a really nice porter. I really enjoyed it. It came on quite a bit tame, but as the finish developed and kept going, it got progressively more intense. Now, it didn't go top tier porter intensity, and even for ones in the same and similar ABV range, but it did finally open up and you could taste the deep, nice, rich roasted malts that came behind the sweetness up front. And then the coffee finally came into play and that started interplaying with the roasty malts. So I did really enjoy it. I gave it certainly above average. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Body on this one. This had a very nice body for kind of a standard ABV range porter. It really had some substance to it. I give it a 9 out of 10. It was well above average. Really nice body to this beer. Mouthfeel. The mouthfeel on this one, porters and stouts, I'm not going to go, we'll make that in a separate video. I've already mentioned this a few times, but body and mouthfeel on porters and stouts do share a lot of commonality, but as a rule, the mouthfeel of a porter is a bit different than a stout. Dry stouts notwithstanding. Porters tend to be a bit more effervescent, and that does get imparted with the mouthfeel. So it's typically not going to have quite that same typical creamy-like texture where it's really silky in the mouth. They can have elements of that, but typically the effervescence that comes through the carbonation is going to override some of that, and it doesn't normally have super fine bubbles to where it generates kind of that creaminess. This was no exception. It was pretty much what I expected for a standard porter in that range, and I enjoyed it. I thought it was above average for sure. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Finish on this beer. Finish on this beer was quite a bit longer than I anticipated. Still, again, talking middle of the road ABV. It's got an average number of fermentables in it for a porter. And you know, the coffee interplay I think was a really good idea because that helped accentuate the roasty malt edge in the back, which really made itself present and made itself known near the end of the finish. And that's where all of that interplay occurred. And I think that it helped extend the length of the finish. It did quite well. I gave it an 8 out of 10. Head and retention on this one. This poured a great head. You know, again, pouring it home from a bottle into a glass, you know, kind of luck of the draw and all the reasons I talk about in almost every review video that I do, but this did well. Not super top end, but certainly well above average. It gets another 8 out of 10. Moving on to the appearance. The appearance really surprised me on this one. Porters tend to be not quite as dark as their stout counterparts, or if we care to use the full term, their stout porter counterparts. But this was really a very deep color. You really couldn't see through it at all, and I was surprised by that. At only 5.3%, so it was clear that the coffee did have an effect as well as the deep roast malts that they chose. At only 5.3, it wasn't that concentrated, but it was lovely. I gave it a 10 out of 10. For the balance, this was a very well balanced beer. The malts and all aspects of them and the different blend that they use really came through. And at first I was afraid that coffee wouldn't really do much, and then it really hit near the apex of the finish and then just kept riding out and helped extend it out. It was just so beautifully balanced. I really enjoyed it. Well above average, I gave it a 9 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. Honestly, I didn't expect to enjoy this beer as well as I did. I was mostly underwhelmed by the prior offerings from Kona Brewing that I had tried. Not bad, not great, just kind of, you know, high end of average kind of territory. But this one I really thought was a very well executed porter. Do I personally still prefer a bigger, bolder beer? Absolutely, yes, I do. And those are the beer styles that I go for as a rule. But this, I think, has much more mass appeal. This is a good, honest porter, and you know, everything that went into making it did such a great job. I really did feel it was well above average. I give it an 8 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style, this is a solid porter. Yet again, it really checked all the boxes for what I look for in the porter. Really, you're talking, coming down to an example of the style, there's so many other beers against which everything else is competing. You got to kind of go back to the basics. What makes a solid porter and how well executed was this? I thought this was very well executed, and they got all the check boxes right for what makes a solid porter. Again, for me, if it just had a little more presence, maybe more fermentables, a little more coffee, to give it a little extra backbone, I could have kicked it up, but still a great score, well above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. That brings the total score on the Pipeline Porter to an 82 out of 100. So that is certainly well above average, and if you're a porter fan, I do recommend trying this at least once. I think you'll enjoy it. Ladies and gentlemen, as always, thank you so much for tuning in. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Likes if you like the video. It helps me know, and certainly it helps others find our content based on YouTube's algorithms. Subscribe. We'll make sure that our videos keep in your feed so you won't lose us. You can always go back to your subscriptions and find us if they stop popping up. And comments. Comments are really big. I want to hear from you. If you have any questions, any thoughts, suggestions, things you'd like to see, things you'd like me to review, I am happy to do so and actively seeking your input. Lastly, if you want to keep in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, just click the notification bell icon that is right next to the subscribe button. Folks, until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.